1. The Shadowed House on Wraith Hill. In a forgotten corner of the world, on the outskirts of a town called Evermore, stood a foreboding mansion atop a mist-shrouded hill. The townsfolk called it Wraith Hill, and for good reason. The house at its peak, known simply as the Wraith House, had an eerie reputation. It was grand and stately, even in decay, with towering windows that stared down upon the town like hollow, watchful eyes. For generations, tales had been told of that house, of lights that flickered even when no one was there, and doors that creaked open on their own, as if inviting anyone bold enough to enter. But no one who ventured into the house ever returned the same. On Halloween night, 5 friends, Emma, Lucas, Ray, Sophie, and Darren, found themselves standing at the foot of Wraith Hill. They were eager for a thrill, drawn by rumors of an unclaimed prize hidden within the walls of the house. It was said that whoever could last until dawn would be rewarded not only with riches but with an ancient family heirloom that had belonged to the original owners, the Wraith family, who had vanished mysteriously a century ago. They brushed aside the whispered warnings of the townspeople, even laughing off tales of the Watcher, a spirit who guarded the house and its secrets with an eternal vigilance. As the friends climbed the winding path up the hill, the fog thickened, muffling the sounds of their footsteps and the distant rustling of trees. The air grew colder, sharper, as if the hill itself resisted their presence. Yet they pressed on, determined to prove their bravery. When they reached the house, they found it even more imposing up close, its stone walls towering over them, each window dark as midnight. Just as they prepared to enter, an old man appeared from the shadows, his face pale and haunted, his voice a brittle whisper. "If you value your lives, turn back now," he warned, his eyes wide and unblinking. The Watcher doesn't take kindly to intruders. The friends exchanged nervous glances, but none of them wanted to appear scared, so they laughed off the man's warning. They each took a deep breath and stepped inside. The grand entry hall greeted them with a cold, unnatural breeze that snaked through the room, stirring the dust-covered curtains and sending a chill down their spines. The chandelier overhead swayed slightly, casting jagged shadows across the walls and floors. A grand staircase dominated the center of the room, spiraling up to a second floor shrouded in darkness. The silence was heavy, oppressive, as though the house itself were watching, waiting. Room by room, they began to explore. The library was their first stop, filled with rows of ancient, leather-bound books that seemed to whisper as they passed. On one dusty shelf, they found a small, faded journal, its pages yellowed with age. The cover bore the name Amelia Wraith, the last known resident of the house. With a shiver, they opened the journal and began to read aloud. Amelia's entries detailed a descent into madness. She wrote of voices calling her name in the dead of night, of shadows that danced at the edges of her vision, and of an overwhelming feeling that she was never alone. The friends chuckled nervously at first, but as they read further, a deep sense of unease crept into their hearts. Amelia's words were frantic, pleading, as if she had known, even as she wrote, that her fate was sealed. As they continued through the house, an odd feeling settled over them, a sense that they were being watched. In the dining room, Darren caught his reflection in a cracked, dusty mirror. But the reflection wasn't right. In the glass, he appeared much older, his face etched with deep lines of fear and despair. His reflection's eyes locked with his, and the mouth moved independently, mouthing the words, "Leave, now." Darren stumbled back, shouting for the others. His friends gathered around, laughing nervously as he tried to explain, but his voice was shaky, his face pale. They moved on, dismissing his fear as a trick of the light, but a lingering unease had taken root among them. The clock in the hallway began to chime suddenly, its face covered in dust and grime. They looked up, confused, its hands weren't moving. Yet the clock continued to chime, the sound echoing through the hallways. They heard footsteps from upstairs, slow and deliberate, as though someone were pacing above them. Goosebumps prickled on their arms, but they dared each other to investigate, and together they climbed the grand staircase. The second floor was darker, colder, with a strange smell that hinted of mold and decay. They explored room by room, finding relics of the past, old photographs, children's toys, and clothing that seemed frozen in time. Each room felt as though it held a story, a memory waiting to be uncovered, and yet each discovery only deepened the mystery of the house. In one of the rooms, they found a large portrait of a woman, Amelia Wraith herself, her face pale and sorrowful. Her eyes seemed to follow them as they moved, her expression one of despair. Emma leaned in close to inspect the painting, her breath fogging up the glass. As she did, a sudden gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the flashlights they had been carrying. When they managed to turn them back on, they found that the portrait had changed. Amelia's eyes were wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream. Their nerves frayed, they decided to split up to cover more ground. Lucas and Sophie went down to the basement, while Ray and Emma explored the attic. Darren stayed behind in the main hall, pacing nervously, his mind racing with the strange visions he had seen. In the basement, Lucas and Sophie found an ancient trunk, bound with heavy chains. Inside were letters detailing dark rituals and curses. One letter, written in Amelia's trembling hand, spoke of a pact with a spirit, the Watcher, who had been bound to protect the house, but at a terrible cost. Upstairs, Ray and Emma discovered an old dollhouse, an exact replica of the Wraith mansion. The rooms of the dollhouse were filled with tiny dolls, each dressed in clothes that matched what they were wearing. As Ray moved one of the dolls, Sophie screamed from the basement, feeling an invisible hand brush against her shoulder. The friends began to realize, with mounting horror, that the dollhouse was somehow linked to their movements. In the main hall, Darren felt a cold, heavy hand rest on his shoulder. He turned slowly, heart hammering, to see a face staring back at him, a man, gaunt and hollow-eyed, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. The figure leaned close, whispering, "They never left." Darren screamed, his voice echoing through the house, summoning the others. Together again, they realized with horror that the front door was locked. The windows, too, were somehow boarded up, though they had been clear when they arrived. Panic surged among them as they pieced together the terrible truth: the Wraith family had never left the house. Their spirits were bound to it, and now the friends were trapped, fated to become part of the curse. In a desperate attempt to escape, they returned to the basement, where they found a hidden room containing an ancient spell to break the curse. But it required a sacrifice. They argued, tensions flaring, each of them desperate to survive. At last, Lucas, the bravest of the group, volunteered. His friends watched, stricken, as he spoke the incantation, sealing his fate. As dawn broke, the four remaining friends stumbled out of the house, their faces drawn and haunted. They looked back to see Lucas standing in the window, his face fading into the shadows, joining the restless spirits of the Wraith family. They swore to never speak of the night again, but each of them knew that Lucas was still there, watching, waiting, another shadow among many. Years later, on another Halloween night, a new group of thrill-seekers ventured up Wraith Hill, drawn by the tales of the haunted mansion and its hidden treasure. As they approached, they saw the faint outline of someone in the window, watching, waiting. Story 2. The Halloween. In the heart of a small, isolated town called Hollow Falls lay a dense forest known as the Shadow Woods. The townsfolk avoided the forest for reasons that were never fully spoken but always understood. Every Halloween, a strange, otherworldly glow seeped through the trees, and those who dared to investigate never returned unchanged. Some emerged days later with hollow, distant eyes, speaking in whispers of things seen but never understood. On Halloween night, a group of 4 friends, Alice, Mark, Jenny, and Caleb, decided they would unravel the mystery of the Shadow Woods once and for all. They had heard the stories all their lives, the legends of the Halloween, a sinister ritual rumored to be carried out by the spirits of the lost every October 31st. Though the townspeople warned them, they shrugged it off as mere superstition, convinced that the story was nothing more than a local legend. As the clock struck midnight, the friends gathered at the edge of the Shadow Woods. Mist hung low in the air, swirling around their feet as they entered. The silence was immediate, heavy. Even the animals seemed to hold their breath, as though nature itself knew to stay away. The trees in the forest were strange, their bark twisted and knotted, each tree looking as though it were writhing in agony. An unnatural fog thickened, and soon, the world around them faded into a haze of shadow and silence. They walked slowly, eyes darting around, and yet something was pulling them forward, a sense of being guided by unseen hands. As they ventured deeper, they began to hear faint whispers. At first, the sounds were so soft they thought it was the wind, but soon the voices grew louder, distinct, each voice layered over the next like a chorus of distant memories. The words were jumbled, unclear, yet one phrase began to emerge. Join us, find the circle." They exchanged uneasy glances, but the pull was too strong to resist. Just then, Alice spotted a flicker of light in the distance. It was a strange, silvery glow, faint but undeniable. They followed it, weaving through the dense trees, until they reached a clearing bathed in an ethereal light. At the center of the clearing was an ancient stone altar, covered in vines and moss. Around the altar lay a circle of stones, each carved with strange symbols. The symbols were foreign, yet something about them felt disturbingly familiar, as though they had seen them in dreams long forgotten. Mark reached out to touch one of the stones, and as his fingers grazed its surface, a shock of cold shot through his arm, paralyzing him momentarily. The forest was silent again, but the air around them had changed. Shadows shifted and danced, though there was no wind to stir them. Alice took a step forward, feeling a strange warmth on the back of her neck. When she turned, she saw nothing, yet the feeling persisted, as though invisible eyes were watching. The whispering returned, louder this time, filling the clearing with a low, rhythmic chant. The friends stood transfixed, each feeling an unspoken dread as the words grew louder. The chants began to echo in their minds, until it felt like the voices were inside their own heads, urging them to sit within the circle. One by one, they obeyed, drawn by an unseen force that clouded their minds and dulled their fear. As they sat, the light grew brighter, and they saw shapes emerging from the shadows, figures, cloaked and hooded, their faces hidden in darkness. The figures moved silently, forming a larger circle around them, trapping the friends inside. Alice tried to stand, but her body felt rooted to the ground. She looked at the others, but they too were frozen, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror. One of the cloaked figures stepped forward, lowering its hood to reveal a face that seemed to shift and blur, like a reflection in disturbed water. "You have come to the Halloween," it said, its voice a low, rasping echo. "Few come willingly, but all must remain." The figure extended a bony hand, pointing at each of them in turn. As its finger landed on Caleb, he felt an intense cold seep into his bones, as though his very soul were being drained. The others watched, helpless, as a dark mist rose from Caleb's body, spiraling up toward the figure, who absorbed it like a hungry void. Caleb's eyes glazed over, his body slumping as though he were a hollow shell. Panic surged through the remaining three, but the figures around them tightened their circle. Mark began to shout, but his voice died in his throat, and he realized he couldn't move his mouth. A wave of despair settled over them as they understood the terrible truth: they were trapped. The chanting grew louder, and the friends felt their own energies begin to wane. One by one, they felt the strange, cold pull as the cloaked figures drew closer, siphoning their strength. Alice, the last one left, looked up at the figure with a final surge of defiance. She reached into her pocket and grasped a small locket she always wore, a gift from her late grandmother, said to protect against evil. As she clutched the locket, a warmth spread through her, breaking the spell that held her frozen. She stumbled to her feet, gripping the locket tightly, feeling it pulse with an energy that pushed back the darkness. With a scream, she raised it toward the figure closest to her, and the creature recoiled, hissing as though in pain. Taking advantage of the moment, Alice grabbed Mark and Jenny, dragging them out of the circle. They stumbled through the forest, the whispers and chants fading behind them as they ran. The trees seemed to reach out, branches clawing at their clothes, but they pushed forward, desperate to escape. When they finally broke through the edge of the forest, they collapsed, gasping for breath. Looking back, they saw the faint glow of the clearing, but the cloaked figures were gone. In the silence, they could still hear the faint echo of the chanting, lingering in their minds like a haunting memory. Alice looked down at the locket in her hand, now cold and lifeless. The friends exchanged a silent vow never to speak of the night again. They returned to town, but each of them knew that a part of them had been left behind in the Shadow Woods. Years passed, and they moved away, but each Halloween, they felt a strange, cold pull, as though something were calling them back. They never spoke of it, but in their dreams, the voices returned, whispering of the Halloween, and of the circle that awaited them, eternal and inescapable. The years passed, and Hollow Falls grew quieter. The woods reclaimed the land, and the townsfolk moved away, leaving the Shadow Woods untouched. But those who remember still warn of the glow that fills the forest each Halloween, and of the spirits who wait, forever seeking new souls to join their circle. Story 3. The Mirror in the Attic. In the quiet, unassuming town of Willowbrook, there was a house no one dared approach, a large Victorian mansion perched on the hill at the edge of town. Known as the Blackwood House, it had been abandoned for decades, but stories of strange sightings and ghostly apparitions kept the townsfolk at bay. Children would dare each other to get close, but no one ever crossed the threshold. This Halloween, however, curiosity got the better of Emma, an avid history enthusiast and urban explorer. She had heard stories of the Blackwood family, who had vanished without a trace in the late 1800s, leaving behind all their possessions. The only clue left behind was a dusty, tattered note found by the first police officers on the scene: "Do not look into the mirror." Emma, intrigued by the mystery, convinced her friends, Tom, Rachel, and David, to join her in exploring the mansion that night. As dusk settled in and a light drizzle began to fall, the four friends made their way up the overgrown path toward the house. The trees, twisted and barren, cast long shadows that seemed to reach out to them as they walked. The house loomed above them, its dark windows like empty eyes watching their every move. The wind whistled through broken shutters, adding an eerie soundtrack to their approach. Pushing open the creaky, ivy-covered door, they entered a grand foyer. Dust particles danced in the weak light from their flashlights, settling on the rich, yet decayed, red velvet wallpaper. The silence was oppressive, swallowing up their footsteps as they moved deeper into the house. Everything had been left as it was: a piano with yellowed keys, chairs covered in cobwebs, and paintings on the walls, their faces blurred with time. They split up, each taking a different room, agreeing to meet back in the foyer if anything interesting turned up. Emma, curious about the attic where the Blackwood family had last been seen, decided to make her way upstairs. She ascended the grand staircase, her footsteps echoing through the hollow halls, until she reached the narrow door at the top of the staircase. The attic door. Emma pushed it open and was met with a blast of cold air. The attic was filled with old trunks, dusty furniture, and boxes stacked to the ceiling. But one thing immediately caught her attention: a large, ornate mirror standing in the center of the room. It was covered with a thick black cloth, fastened with a single frayed ribbon. Recalling the warning, Emma hesitated, but her curiosity won out. She carefully untied the ribbon and removed the cloth, revealing the mirror's surface. To her surprise, it was pristine, not a speck of dust. The frame was carved with intricate symbols, twisting and curling like vines, giving off an unnatural glow in the dim light. As she gazed into the mirror, she saw her own reflection, but something felt off. Her reflection seemed to be watching her intently, studying her with a cold, calculating expression. She tilted her head, and the reflection tilted its head a fraction of a second later, a delay that sent a chill down her spine. Back in the foyer, Tom and Rachel were rummaging through the study, examining old books and documents, when they heard Emma's voice calling to them from the attic. Her voice was clear, yet strangely distant, as if muffled by something unseen. "Come up here. I found something interesting. Tom and Rachel exchanged puzzled glances. They hadn't heard Emma go upstairs, but they assumed she must have found a back staircase. They made their way up, their flashlights casting strange shadows on the walls as they climbed the narrow staircase. When they reached the attic, they saw Emma standing before the mirror, her back to them. But something was wrong. She was unnaturally still, her arms at her sides, her head slightly bowed. They approached cautiously, calling her name, but she didn't respond. As they drew closer, Tom noticed something that made him freeze. Emma's reflection was smiling, even though her back was to the mirror. A sense of dread washed over him as he reached out to touch her shoulder. The moment he did, her eyes snapped open, and she turned to face him, her expression blank, as though she were in a trance. The Emma in the mirror, however, was still smiling, watching with an intensity that felt almost predatory. "Emma, are you okay?" Rachel asked, her voice barely a whisper. Emma blinked slowly, as if waking from a dream, and turned to the mirror. Her reflection was now matching her movements perfectly, but the eerie feeling lingered. She seemed dazed, her eyes glassy, as she whispered, "There's something wrong with this mirror." David, who had been exploring the basement, heard the commotion and joined the group in the attic. As they explained what they had seen, he scoffed, dismissing it as an overactive imagination. To prove his point, he stepped in front of the mirror and stared into it, daring it to scare him. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and to their horror, David's reflection slowly began to change. His face twisted, becoming gaunt and hollow, his eyes sunken and empty, until he looked like a hollowed-out shell of himself. David staggered back, breaking his gaze, and the mirror returned to normal. Panicked, they decided to leave, but as they turned to go, they heard a low whisper echo through the attic. "You cannot leave. You are part of the reflection now." Their hearts pounding, they rushed toward the door, but it slammed shut before they could reach it. The room grew colder, and the mirror seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as though it were alive and hungry. Shadows began to gather around its edges, twisting and writhing like living smoke. Emma felt a tug, a strange pull toward the mirror. She fought it, digging her heels into the floor, but it was no use. One by one, they were drawn to the mirror, as if invisible hands were dragging them closer. Their reflections in the mirror grew darker, more twisted, and as they reached the surface, each one felt a chilling sensation wash over them. Suddenly, they were standing in a strange, mirrored version of the attic, a dark, distorted reflection of the world they knew. The mirror had pulled them inside. They looked around, seeing themselves trapped in a version of the house where everything was reversed, bathed in an unnatural, flickering light. The room was filled with ghostly figures, past victims, forever trapped in the mirror, their faces pale and hollow. Each one whispered, pleading for help, their voices a faint echo that filled the room with an unbearable sorrow. The friends realized that they were now part of the mirror's collection, their lives forever bound to the twisted, haunted house. Desperate to escape, they searched the room for any sign of a way out. But every door they opened led back to the mirror, and each time they looked, their reflections grew darker, less human, as though they were slowly losing themselves to the cursed world within. Time passed strangely in the mirror's world. Minutes felt like hours, days felt like seconds. They could feel their identities slipping, their memories fading, until they no longer remembered who they were. On Halloween night, a year later, four new explorers ventured into the attic of the Blackwood house. They found the mirror, still covered with the black cloth. As they lifted it, they saw four shadowy figures staring back at them, trapped forever, their eyes hollow, their faces empty. And in that moment, Emma, Tom, Rachel, and David knew they were doomed to wait, eternally, for someone else to take their place, and free them from the reflection's dark grasp.